He didn't ask for a bride to keep his bed warm. He asked for a survivor, someone who wouldn't snap when the winter isolation set in, who knew the difference between a loose cinch and a tight one. What Gideon got was a woman who made the harsh mountain look tame. Gideon stood on the warped, splintered boardwalk of Oakhaven. The air smelled of mule dung, wet alkali dust, and stale beer venting from the saloon doors. He scratched the side of his jaw, hearing the dry rasp of a 3-day beard against his calloused palm. The telegram said she was coming on the noon stage. He hadn't bothered to wear a suit. He wore canvas trousers, stiff with old axle grease, and a heavy wool coat that smelled faintly of copper blood and pine pitch. He figured she might as well see what she was getting into from minute one. If she took one look at him, turned around, and got back on the stagecoach, it saved them both the trouble of starving in the high country. The stage rumbled into town, its heavy wooden wheels kicking up a cloud of chalky dust that coated the back of Gideon's throat. He spat into the dirt. 4 passengers climbed out, a drummer wrestling with a cheap leather trunk, a woman clutching a crying, red-faced baby, an old man with a cane. No bride. Gideon felt a sour, hard twist in his gut. Relief, mostly. A little sting of rejection, sharp and unexpected. He turned on his heel to walk back to his gelding. "You Gideon Ridge?" The voice didn't come from the stagecoach. It came from behind him, down the center of the street. Gideon turned. She sat atop a roan mare, a lean, ugly thing with a deep chest and crazy rolling eyes. The woman wasn't in a gingham dress or a travel corset. She wore men's trousers, tucked into scuffed, mud-caked boots, and a heavy canvas duster that had seen better decades. A felt hat was pulled low over her eyes, but he could see the dirt smudged on her cheek, the chapped, cracked line of her lips. She held the reins with hands wrapped in worn leather work gloves. A pack mule stood tethered behind her mare, chewing on a bit of stray hay. "I'm Ridge," he said. His voice sounded rusty, scraping against his throat. It always did when he came down from the mountain. He went weeks without speaking a single word. "Josephine," she said. She didn't offer a last name. She didn't dismount. She just sat there, looking down at him. Her eyes were the color of old copper pennies, and she assessed him the way a cynical buyer assesses a draft horse checking for swaybacks and bad tempers. "Your letter said you needed a partner for a high-altitude claim. Said the trail was too rough for a wagon, so I better know how to ride. You rode all the way from Denver?" "Stagecoach made me sick," she said flatly. "Too many people breathing the same air. Bought the roan in Cheyenne." Gideon looked at the mare. The horse was blowing hard, sides heaving, but its ears were pricked and alert. It was a vicious-looking beast that took a hard hand and a heavy seat to control. "She looks mean." "She is," Josephine said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "We get along." Gideon nodded slowly. He didn't quite know what to do with his hands. He hooked his thumbs into his suspenders, then dropped them back to his sides. Cabin's a 5-hour climb. "We'll lose the light in 3. "Then we better stop burning daylight," she said. She adjusted her seat, the heavy saddle leather creaking a sharp, dry protest in the quiet street. He mounted his gelding, a heavy, sure-footed beast named Stump. As they rode out of town, Gideon kept stealing glances back over his shoulder. Usually, Flatlanders hugged the saddle horn on the mountain incline. They stiffened up, threw the horse off balance, and looked down at the drops with wide, terrified eyes. Josephine rode loose. She moved with the roan, taking the steep, rocky grade like water flowing over stones. She didn't talk. The only sounds were the clatter of iron shoes striking granite, the heavy breathing of the animals, and the wind picking up through the lodgepole pines. The higher they got, the colder it snapped. The air thinned out, biting viciously at the inside of the lungs. Gideon watched her shoulders. They didn't hunch against the chill. She just reached back, unstrapped a wool blanket from her bedroll, and draped it over her shoulders, without breaking the horse's stride or taking her eyes off the trail. He had placed an ad in a matrimonial paper because the winters were getting too long. The absolute silence of the cabin had started ringing in his ears, a high-pitched whine that sounded like the edge of madness. He wanted a voice. He wanted a presence. But so far, this woman was as quiet as the timberline. When they finally reached the ridge, the cabin sitting squat and ugly against a backdrop of jagged, snow-capped peaks, it was near dark. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple. "This is it," Gideon said. his voice loud in the vast emptiness. Josephine looked at the mud-chinked logs, the sagging porch roof, the meat smoker made of rusted iron. She didn't sigh. She didn't complain. She swung down from the roan, her boots hitting the frozen dirt with a heavy thud. "Where's the grain?" she asked. "Shed out back." She took her mare's reins and the mule's lead rope in one hand. "I'll see to the stock. You get a fire going. It smells like snow." Gideon stood there for a second, watching her walk toward the shed. He felt a weird prickle at the back of his neck. He was used to giving the orders on this mountain. He wasn't sure if he was annoyed or entirely relieved. He turned and went inside. Part 2. The breakaway. The first 2 weeks were a study in avoidance. The cabin was a single room, 14 by 16 feet, 2 iron cots on opposite walls, a cast iron stove that doubled as a heater and a cooker, a rough-hewn table, and crooked shelves holding canned beans, flour, and coffee. It smelled of old smoke, damp wool, and the sharp metallic tang of rifle oil. Now, it also smelled of her, lye soap, and cold dust. It was a contradiction that messed with Gideon's head. They didn't talk much. Gideon learned that Josephine liked her coffee black enough to strip paint. He learned she slept on her back, straight as a board, hands folded over her stomach like a corpse bracing for the earth. She learned that Gideon had a bad left knee that popped like a gunshot when he stood up, and that he mumbled in his sleep angry, guttural sounds of a man fighting unseen ghosts. She pulled her weight. She chopped wood. She didn't swing the axe with brute force. She swung it with a frightening, calculated precision, letting the heavy weight of the iron do the work, splitting the pine rounds cleanly in half with every strike. Gideon watched her from the window one morning, a mug of coffee warming his calloused hands. She was breathing hard, a sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the freezing air. Her movements were economic. No wasted energy. No hesitation. He didn't know how to act around her. He had expected a woman to soften the place up, to try and hang curtains maybe, complain about the dirt floor and the draft creeping under the door. She didn't care about the floor. She only cared that the rifles were clean and the horses were fed. It made him feel useless, in a way he couldn't articulate. He had braced himself to be the protector, the seasoned mountain man keeping the fragile, mail-order bride alive through the freeze. Instead, he felt like a boarder in his own home. The real test came on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of a bruised iron skillet, heavy and low. The wind was screaming down the canyon, ripping dead branches off the pines and hurling them against the cabin walls. Gideon was fixing a broken trace chain on the porch. Josephine was down by the corral, breaking an inch of solid ice in the water trough with a heavy iron crowbar. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A low, terrifying rumble, followed by a sharp, cracking boom. A rock slide on the upper ridge. The noise was deafening. The ground vibrated up through the soles of Gideon's boots. Down in the corral, the horses panicked. The roan mare reared, her front hooves striking the top rail of the wooden fence. Stump, usually docile, lunged forward in blind terror. The rotting, weather-beaten wood of the corral gate gave way with a splintering crack. Before Gideon could drop his tools and run, the horses were out. They burst through the splintered gate, eyes rolling white, kicking up frozen clumps of mud as they bolted toward the tree line. Losing the horses in this weather meant death. Without them, they couldn't haul wood, couldn't get to town for supplies. They would be stranded, waiting to freeze or starve. Gideon ran, his bad knee screaming in protest. "Joe, get back!" he yelled, the wind snatching the words from his mouth and throwing them down the mountain. But Josephine wasn't retreating. She had dropped the crowbar. As the roan mare bolted past her, Josephine didn't flinch away from the flailing, deadly hooves. She lunged. She grabbed a desperate handful of the mare's coarse mane. The sheer momentum of the heavy horse jerked her violently off her feet. For a heart-stopping second, Gideon thought she was going to be trampled, dragged to pieces, over the frozen, jagged rocks. Instead, using the horse's own forward motion, she swung her leg up and over the bare back. It was a violent, ugly mount. There was nothing graceful about it. She slammed onto the horse's spine, her fingers twisted desperately into the mane. The mare bucked. A vicious, twisting crow hop, meant to dislodge the predator on her back. Josephine didn't fall. She flattened herself against the horse's neck. She had no saddle, no bridle, just a fistful of hair and sheer, stubborn gravity. "Hiya!" she screamed, kicking her heels brutally into the mare's flanks. She didn't try to stop the panicked horse. She leaned into the run, driving the mare faster, angling her towards Stump, who was veering dangerously close to the steep, rocky ravine on the left. Gideon stopped running. He stood in the freezing mud, his breath pluming in thick white clouds, watching a masterclass in horsemanship. She wasn't fighting the horse's panic. She was steering it. She rode like a demon, her canvas duster snapping in the wind like dark wings. She cut Stump off just before the tree line. Leaning so far over the roan's neck, she looked horizontal. She reached out, slapping the heavy gelding hard on the nose, turning him back toward the safety of the cabin. She wheeled the roan around, using her knees and her body weight to force the angry mare into a tight circle. The horse fought her, rearing again, pawing at the gray sky. Josephine just moved with the violence, anchored by her thighs, her face a mask of furious, pale concentration. She drove both horses back into the broken corral. Gideon walked up slowly as she slid off the mare. Her hands were shaking. Her chest heaved beneath the heavy coat. The mare was covered in a lather of white sweat, trembling violently. Josephine didn't look at Gideon. She grabbed a rope halter off the fence post and shoved it onto the mare's head, buckling it with clumsy, freezing fingers. "I'll patch the gate," Gideon said. His voice was quiet. The roaring in his ears wasn't the wind anymore. It was the sudden, sharp realization of what he was looking at. Josephine leaned her forehead against the mare's sweaty neck, closing her eyes for a second. When she opened them and looked at Gideon, the cold cynicism he usually saw there was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged adrenaline. "Make it quick," she rasped, her breath hitching, "or they'll blow right through it again." She turned her back to him to check the gelding's legs for cuts. Gideon stood there for a moment. He smelled the sour tang of horse sweat and the metallic ozone of the approaching snowstorm. He looked at the woman he had sent for a woman he thought he'd have to teach how to survive. He walked over to grab the heavy wooden rails. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He knew with absolute certainty that if it came down to it, she was the one who was going to keep him alive. The snow didn't fall. It buried them. By late November, the drifts reached the lower windowsills. The world outside was a blinding, featureless white, and the cabin shrank until it felt like a wooden coffin. The silence Gideon had feared didn't return, but it was replaced by a different kind of tension. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of two solitary creatures forced to breathe the same stagnant air. The cabin smelled constantly of wet wool, boiled chicory, and the sharp, piney sap bleeding from the firewood. Josephine didn't complain about the confinement. She took to mending harness leather, sitting by the stove for hours with a heavy awl and a spool of waxed thread. Gideon worked on his traps, filing the iron teeth down until they were razor sharp. They existed in a quiet orbit, dodging each other's knees when they crossed the narrow floor. He caught her flinching on a Thursday. She was pulling a tight stitch through a stiff piece of latigo. The needle slipped. She sucked in a sharp breath through her teeth and dropped the leather. Gideon looked up from his whetstone. "Prick your finger?" "No," she muttered. She shoved her left hand into her pocket. Gideon set the whetstone down. The scrape of stone on metal stopped, leaving the roaring draft of the stove painfully loud in the small room. He stood, his bad knee clicking. "Show me." "It's nothing, just stiff." "Josephine." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The flat, hard edge of it was enough. He walked over and held out his hand. She stared at his calloused palm for a long moment. Her jaw muscle ticked. Slowly, she pulled her hand from her pocket. Gideon felt his stomach drop. The heel of her palm was swollen, the skin stretched tight and shining with a sickly, angry red hue. A jagged black scab sat at the center, a souvenir from the splintered corral gate 2 weeks prior. A thin, angry red line was creeping up the inside of her wrist, vanishing beneath the cuff of her flannel shirt. "You tore it on the wood," he said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "I washed it out. Not well enough. You've got blood poison tracking up your arm." He dropped her hand and turned toward the shelf, grabbing a tin basin and a bottle of high-proof rye. "It just needs a poultice," she argued, standing up. She hated the exposure. He could see it in the rigid line of her shoulders. She operated on the belief that ignoring a weakness made it disappear. "A poultice won't dig out a piece of rotten pine embedded an inch deep in your muscle," Gideon said. He set the basin on the table. He grabbed his hunting knife, holding the steel blade flat against the glowing iron of the stove until it smoked. "Sit down." "Gideon." "Sit down, Joe." He turned to look at her. "Unless you want to lose the arm by Sunday." She sat. She didn't look at the knife, and she didn't look at him. She stared at the frost patterns icing over the window pane. Gideon poured a heavy splash of rye over her palm. She didn't make a sound, but her fingers curled into a rigid claw. "This is going to be bad," he warned her. He handed her a thick piece of scrap leather. "Bite on that." She took it, placing it between her teeth. Gideon sat opposite her, pinning her wrist to the table with his left hand. His grip was an iron vise. He felt the frantic, rabbit-quick thud of her pulse against his thumb. It was the first time he had actually touched her skin since she arrived. It was burning hot. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He pressed the hot, sterilized tip of the knife into the infected tissue. Josephine's back arched. A low, guttural sound tore from her throat, muffled by the leather. She fought him, instinct taking over, her arm jerking violently against his hold. "Hold still," he barked, bearing down with his weight. "I almost have it." Sweat beaded on his forehead. The smell of infected blood and scorched skin filled the space between them. He dug the blade under the black sliver of wood and flicked it upward. A thick, dark piece of rotted pine clattered into the tin basin, followed immediately by a rush of foul, yellow pus and dark blood. Josephine slumped forward, her forehead hitting the rough wood of the table. She spat the leather out. She was gasping for air, her skin a waxy, translucent gray. Gideon exhaled a shaky breath. His own hands were trembling. He grabbed a clean rag, soaking it in the whiskey, and pressed it hard against the open wound. She hissed, but the fight was gone out of her. He bound her hand tight with clean linen strips. When he finished, he didn't let go of her hand right away. He looked at the knuckles, scarred and battered, dirt permanently ground into the creases. They were the hands of a woman who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. "You're a damn fool," he said softly. She kept her head down against the table. "If I told you I was hurt," she whispered, her voice rough, "you would have thought I was a liability." Gideon felt a tightness in his chest, a sudden sharp ache that had nothing to do with the altitude. "I asked for a partner, Josephine, not a mule. Partners tell each other when the wagon's got a broken wheel." She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes, the fever already setting into her bones. The fever hit her like a runaway freight train. By midnight, the storm outside had escalated into a full-blown blizzard, rattling the heavy log walls. Inside, Josephine was burning alive. Gideon dragged her cot closer to the stove. He stripped off his heavy wool coat and piled it on top of her blankets. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard he thought they might crack. "Cold," she muttered, tossing her head against the lumpy pillow. "Need to check the roan. She'll kick the stall. Horses are fine." "I checked them," Gideon lied. He hadn't been outside in hours. He wasn't leaving her. He sat on the floor beside her cot, a bucket of snow melting by the stove. He dipped a rag into the freezing water, wrung it out, and laid it across her forehead. The water hissed against her skin, steaming faintly in the cold air of the cabin. She grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, lacking the iron strength she usually possessed, but her nails dug into his skin. Her copper eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused. "Don't send me back," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a desperate, raw plea. Gideon froze. "I'm not sending you anywhere. He'll find me. If I'm on the flats, he'll find me." She squeezed his wrist tighter. A tear, hot and unbidden, slipped out of the corner of her eye and tracked through the dust on her cheek. Gideon's jaw tightened. He didn't know who he was. A husband, a father, a debt collector. It didn't matter. He felt a sudden, violent surge of protectiveness that startled him. He realized, sitting on the cold dirt floor, that he didn't just want her here because she could chop wood or ride a rank horse. He wanted her here because when she looked at him, he felt like a man who actually mattered. "No one is coming up this mountain," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He pried her fingers gently off his wrist, but he didn't let go of her hand. He interlaced his large, calloused fingers with hers. "I've got a Winchester loaded with 44s and a dead drop down a 500-foot ravine. Anyone comes looking for you, they'll find the bottom of it." Josephine stared at him. The frantic terror in her eyes slowly began to ebb, replaced by a heavy, exhausted relief. She let out a long breath, her body going limp against the mattress. "Okay," she whispered. She closed her eyes. "Okay, Gideon." He sat there for the rest of the night. He didn't sleep. He kept the fire roaring, feeding pine rounds into the iron belly of the stove until the metal glowed cherry red. He changed the cold rag on her forehead every 20 minutes. He listened to the wind scream, and he listened to the steady, shallow rhythm of her breathing. Sometime around dawn, the wind died. The sudden silence was deafening. Gideon woke with a start. He had slumped against the side of her cot, his neck stiff and aching. The fire had burned down to glowing orange embers. He looked at Josephine. The flush was gone from her cheeks. Her breathing was deep and even. He reached out, brushing the back of his knuckles against her cheek. Her skin was cool. The fever had broken. She stirred, letting out a soft groan. She blinked her eyes open, squinting against the harsh, bright glare of the morning sun, reflecting off the snow through the frosted window. She looked at the ceiling, then turned her head to look at Gideon. He looked like hell. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard matted, his face drawn with exhaustion. Josephine slowly pushed herself up onto her elbows. She looked down at her right hand, heavily bandaged and resting on the blanket. The throbbing ache was still there, but the sickening, fiery heat of the poison was gone. She looked back at Gideon. "You look worse than the mule." A slow, tired smile cracked through the dirt and beard on Gideon's face. "You should see the mule." He grabbed the edge of the cot and pulled himself up, his knee giving a loud, protesting pop. He walked over to the stove, throwing a handful of kindling onto the embers and blowing until they caught flame. He set the coffee pot over the heat. "My hand," she said, her voice raspy. "It's better, for now. You keep it clean. You're on cooking duty for the next week. I'll split the wood." Josephine didn't argue. She watched his broad back as he measured out the coffee grounds. The defensive, cynical armor she had worn since she stepped off the stagecoach in Oakhaven felt suddenly heavy, useless. She had expected a transaction, a brutal trade of labor for shelter. "Gideon," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "Thank you." She didn't say it lightly. The words were heavy, carrying the weight of a debt she actually wanted to owe. Gideon turned back to the stove. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't want to spook her. "Coffee's going to take 10 minutes. Then I've got to dig out the shed. You think you can manage frying some salt pork one-handed?" "I can manage," she said, pulling the wool blanket a little tighter around her shoulders. The cabin was still freezing, the wind still howling over the jagged peaks outside. They still had 4 months of brutal, isolating winter ahead of them. But as the smell of strong coffee and wood smoke began to fill the small room, the absolute silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. It felt like home. If this gritty tale of survival and unspoken bonds kept you hooked, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to support the channel and share this story with anyone who loves a true, grounded Western drama. What did you think of Gideon and Josephine's brutal first winter? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another wild ride into the untamed frontier.